Welcome to Living Well with MS. This podcast comes to you from Overcoming MS, the world's leading multiple sclerosis healthy lifestyle charity, which helps people live a full and healthy life through the Overcoming MS program. We interview a range of experts and people with multiple sclerosis. Please remember, all opinions expressed are their own. Don't forget to subscribe to Living Well with MS on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. And now, let's meet our guest.
Welcome to the latest edition of the Living Well with MS podcast. Joining me on this edition is Mike Newton. Mike is an industrial chemist who worked for Unilever in natural oils and fats and their chemical derivatives, and we supply these into many industrial and food applications, so he is an expert in the field of oils and fats. Mike is also someone with MS who follows the Overcoming MS protocol. So he has particular knowledge and interest in our diet and fats, and the fat part particularly of our diet. So, welcome, Mike.
Thanks, Jeff.
I think we're going to jump straight into the technical side of this. So, we talk about oils and fats, and I think we just use the terms, and a lot of us don't fully understand what the differences are. So, just to get some understanding, what is the difference between oils and fats, but also more complex terms like triglycerides and lipids?
Okay, well, triglycerides is really the encompassing description of all oils and fats, whether they be from plant, animal, and whether they be liquid or solid. They're all triglycerides, and they all have the same chemical structure, and that's the chemical name for them. The term oil and fat is more for the layman and the cooking man. An oil is a liquid at room temperature and fat is a solid at room temperature. So I prefer to just refer to all of them as triglycerides and explain the difference between the triglycerides and why their melting point, or why they're solids or why they're liquids, is virtually or totally up to the structure of the triglyceride. Sterols is another medical term which is used for triglycerides, waxes, diglycerides, monoglycerides, and other products, other things which do not dissolve in water. They're hydrophobic and they don't like water, and that's called sterols. You might see that sometimes in your blood analysis or something, but I have no expertise in sterols. I only have the expertise in the triglycerides bit, which is the main part of sterols anyway. So the triglyceride is really the best way to describe it is a three-legged stool. So at the top of the stool is a glycerol molecule, and then the three legs are long carbon chains. The only atoms or products that are in triglycerides are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And most of it is carbon and hydrogen. So they're long legs. They're all in even numbers. Nature, animals, everybody makes triglyceride carbon chains in only even numbers. And they start at 12 long and go right through to 22 long. So, and each stool, the length of the carbon chains, most of the time is a different length. They're not all the same. Sometimes two of them might be the same and one different, but most of the time there's three different types. So when they go into your body, in your gut, they will not pass through into your system without being broken down into fatty acids first. And so the enzymes in our gut break the fat into fatty acids, which is the three legs of the stool and the glycerol seat, if you like. And you need water for that, and you also need an enzyme. And there's enzymes in your body that does that. This reaction is equilibrium. In other words, it can also reform the fat in some cases. So for the fat to pass through into your working system and make other chemicals in your system, it breaks down into a fatty acid, and then when it gets through your system, it may firm back into a fat or not. Now, there's three types that we talk about fats. First of all, we talked about the length. The second one is a saturated fat. And a saturated fat is where all of the carbons in the chain, whether it be 12 or 22, have no double bonds and are saturated with hydrogen atoms. And I've made a little model here of the type of thing that a saturated fat looks like. Each carbon must have 4 bonds. So they have two joining one another carbons on each leg, and then the 2 red dots are the hydrogen atoms that are going. And these are spinning around at rate of knots. They're not stationary. And at the end, there's 3 hydrogens because there's no carbon at the end. Interestingly, the one at the end is where you start counting the length of the chain, and we'll talk about that when we come to omega fatty acids. The next one is the cis chain, where there is a double bond, and you can see because there's a double bond, there are 2 hydrogens missing. And you can see that the 2 hydrogens that are there on the double bond are on the same side. And cis is a Latin prefix for being on the same side. And these typically have a lower melting point than the next model I'm going to show you, which is the trans. The trans might have the same number of carbons and the same double bonds in the same spots, but the hydrogens are on the other side. That's the Latin prefix for trans. So one down and one up. Now these have a very, very high melting point. And that's why when we talk about don't eat foods with trans fatty acids in, it's because they have a very high melting point, regardless of the length of the carbon chain or how many double bonds are in the carbon chain. We'll talk about that in a minute as well. So that's sort of covered the basic chemistry of triglycerides, and we'll move on to the next question.
So, just to clarify a little bit that, so I always just assumed that a trans fatty acid, I thought the trans was something that humans had done to it, but is that a natural?
It's natural.
Yeah. So although you
natural.
get these trans fatty acids, that doesn't necessarily mean that anything's been done to them.
No, it's particular plants or animals, and that's purely by chance that they are on opposite sides or on the same side.
Okay. So you've mentioned saturated triglyceride. So what's an unsaturated triglyceride or oil?
So an unsaturated triglyceride is exactly as I showed you, where there's a double bond, and because there's a double bond, those 2 carbons can only have 4 bonds. So they only have 1 hydrogen each. So they are not saturated with hydrogen. When they're saturated with hydrogen, they have no double bonds, and they each have 2 hydrogens coming off, and one going to another carbon and one to the other carbon. So it's a fully saturated chain of red dots and no double bonds.
Okay, and then the other thing that was, certainly when I was growing up, was a big thing. They would talk about polyunsaturated fats, and that being a good thing, which I don't know whether it is now, but it was always your spread was always polyunsaturated. So what's polyunsaturated?
Okay, well, with the carbon chain, as I said, going from 12 to 22, the first length of the carbon chain that can have a double bond and be unsaturated is a 16. So 12 and 14 don't have double bonds, but 16 do, and they can have 1 double bond, and that's unsaturated. And because it's only 1 double bond, it's called monounsaturated, meaning 1. When you get to 18 carbons long, you can have actually 3 double bonds. You can have 1, as I said, the carbon chain or the foot, the length of the stool leg, at the bottom of the leg is your last carbon. That's when you start counting, and you count up from the bottom carbon, and you go 1, 2, 3, and between 3 and 4 there can be a double bond, and between 6 and 7 there can be a double bond, and between 9 and 10 there can be a double bond. Don't ask me why, but that's the only places where nature allows them to form, between the 3, 6 and 9 carbon going up the chain. And when you've got 2 double bonds or 3 double bonds, that's polyunsaturated, because that means many unsaturation.
Okay. And I mean, I think we'll probably get onto the technical, the health side of it, but there was an implication that polyunsaturated was better. So is that many double bonds? Would it be better for your health to be polyunsaturated?
Yes, it is. It is. Mono, double, or triple bonded chains have a much lower melting point than saturated chains. So that's why it's better for your health, in that it has a lower melting point.
And then the final one I want to ask you about is one we hear a lot about now, is hydrogenated fats or hydrogenated triglycerides.
Right. So those double bonds that I showed you in the chain, we can't make those. We don't know how to do that commercially. That's nature makes those double bonds. But what we can do is we can destroy them and add hydrogens across those, so it becomes a fully saturated chain again. And we do that by bombarding the triglyceride with hydrogen at very high temperatures with a catalyst involved, and that makes all of the fats and oils, or the triglycerides that are in the tank, fully saturated. And you end up with something like this. And that's a candle, and that is 55% C16 fully saturated and 45% C18 fully saturated. And it's as hard as a rock. And that's what you can get when you eat saturated fats, because that's fully saturated, 100%.
And so that's done in like industrial or chemically by blasting with hydrogen.
Yes, it is.
So to get on to the more sort of natural side of things, what's the difference between a plant or an animal or a fish triglyceride or fat?
Okay, well, they're all completely different. Every animal is a different composition of triglycerides. Every plant is a different composition. Every peanut or ground nut is a different composition, as is every seed that's grown. So, for example, sunflower, safflower, canola, they're all slightly different, but they're all different. And then you go right down to the bottom end, coconut oil, completely different. And then beef tallow or beef triglyceride is different from lamb triglyceride, is different from pig triglyceride. So they're all completely different. And it would take me hours to explain the differences. But the ones from animals and coconut are mainly saturated. That's why in OMS we don't go near coconut oil or animal fats at all. And then, interestingly enough, there's some in the plant area which we should avoid as well. And the one that, you need to look them up and see how much of what percentage of them is saturated. But there's some nuts that have got too much saturation and you wouldn't go near them. And there's other nuts that have got some interesting unsaturated fats which would have a low melting point. So you need to examine them and see. But typically what Overcoming MS says don't eat foods which have more than 2% saturated fats. So look on the pack. If it's got more than 2%, avoid it.
Yeah, I mean that's like chemically that's absolutely fine. So I mean that's what I do. I look because the great thing now is pretty much everywhere, and actually it works in any language as well because they tend to always be fat followed by saturated fat, and they always seem to be in the right.
Yes.
So even in like German or French or something, I can still work out what it is.
Yes.
And it almost always has 100 grams of per 100 grams. How much have you got? And you're like, okay, if it's 1.3, yes. I'm like, well, that's okay. But yeah, you're right. Some things are marketed as vegan and healthy food, but they have crazily high numbers. And yeah, if you look at coconut, it's that's very high.
Yes. Well, the reason that they hydrogenate fats is to give them structure so that they can make a pie that you can eat with ease without it all collapsing around you while you're eating it. So it's purely done for your mouth feel and structure so you can eat it. It's not done in a mischievous way. It's more done for a practical way of allowing you to have a nice meat pie or something like that without having to use a knife and fork.
And as an Australian, you obviously need to, meat pies are an important part of your culture, having travelled around Australia.
Not for the RMSs.
No, we have the same thing where I live with pasties, Cornish pasties. So yeah, that's one thing I had to adapt my own version. You never, yes. But you're right, you don't get the structural side of it, so they're a bit flaky. But yeah. So the other thing we hear about is omega 3, 6, and 9. So we're looking to actually increase things like flaxseed oil. So that's another number that is in there as well. I mean, I'm just guessing here, the three legs, whether that's connected with the 3, 6, and 9. But so what's the difference between omega 3, 6, and 9 triglycerides?
Okay. Well, that's a good question. So if you take one of the legs, omega means 18. So it's 18 carbons long, right? And if you start from the bottom of the leg and you go 1, 2, 3, and then there's a double bond between number 3 carbon and number 4 carbon, that's omega 3 fatty acid, or part of the fat, but it's one leg we're talking about. If you go for omega 6, that means that there's a double bond between carbon number 6 and carbon number 7. And omega 9 means 18 carbons long again, 9 and 10. Now they're called essential fats. And the reason they're called essential is because in our body, we don't make them. So the only way we can get them into our body is to ingest them. So that's why people say you should have omega fats. And fish oil is a good example. Linseed or flaxseed oil is another good example where there's a high proportion of omega fats.
And does it matter which omega fats we have, or it's just the fact that we require them for healthy living, and so we need to have the correct amount?
Yeah, that's beyond my expertise as to which ones we should have or not have.
But it's the fact that we can't produce them in our body, so we need to have enough.
We can only get them in oily fish, fish oil, and flaxseed oil. Predominantly. They are in everything, but in minuscule amounts. Those are the ones which have the most amount.
Mm-hmm. And so you've mentioned monoglycerides and diglycerides. So what's the difference between those? And
okay,
what are monoglycerides and diglycerides?
That's a good question, and it's a bit sneaky on the packaging to look at those, because they can have a very high melting point. As you know, our brain temperature is 37 degrees centigrade or 98 degrees Fahrenheit. So the fat in our brain, or the triglycerides or diglycerides or monoglycerides in our brain, we'd prefer their melting point to be lower than the 37 or 98 degrees Fahrenheit. And diglycerides are basically two-legged stools, meaning di. Triglycerides is 3 and mono is 1. So if that leg of the stool is saturated, it will have a very high melting point. If it's unsaturated or polyunsaturated, it will have a low melting point. And they don't tell you which one they are. They just say they're diglycerides or monoglycerides. And the reason they put them in is because they're fantastic at emulsifying things. So you can whip up a lot of air in them and you can whip up a lot of water in them. So a classic example is when you buy mayonnaise or ice cream. Ice cream has a lot of diglycerides or monoglycerides specifically put in them to allow to get as much air and water in it when you buy it. So
just to clarify, emulsifying that's when you can mix water and oil without them separating. Yeah. Okay.
But this actually helps you in the emulsifying process, and allows them to get even more water and more air in it, so that their cost of what they're selling you is lower. So they're not mentioned as saturated fats or unsaturated fats on the packaging. They will be, I think the number that they use universally is 417. So if you look at the ingredients and you see 417 in it, that's diglycerides or monoglycerides, emulsifying agents.
Right, so it's more complicated than just looking at the saturated fat percentage, but...
Well, there will be a very low percentage of emulsifying agents because they're made in reverse. So you turn your fat or your triglyceride into fatty acids, and then you react them again with glycerine to make a one-legged stool or a two-legged stool in industry. They can do that. And therefore, you get a specific emulsifying agent. And it's only in very small percentages in most products.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? I think from what you were saying, they're trying to sell you air a lot of the time.
And water.
Yeah. So they're actually trying to sell you stuff that's almost free. But
yes.
There we go. So if we stick with a whole food diet, then we don't have that sort of issue with those.
No.
Because they'll be commercial, right? So to go back then in the Overcoming MS side, so prior to Overcoming MS, there was Professor Roy Swank, whose work really inspired George Jelinek, that there was this link, particularly between fats and health for people with MS. So if you're aware, how did Professor Roy Swank discover a link between MS and hard fats or saturated fats?
Yeah. Well, I before I came across the OMS, in the early 90s when I was diagnosed, I read most of the Swank information, and particularly his eulogy is very, if you read his eulogy, you see that he was studying in Germany and he noticed that a lot of people that had MS in Germany were also overweight. And he put the theory that overweight people got MS. Then he went back to Canada and he refined the theory to people that eat saturated or hard fats seem to have MS more than people that don't. And he took the theory that the brain is a very high percentage of fat and cholesterol, and that if that's rock hard like this candle, then when it's rattling around in your head, the lesions in your brain will be scraping against your skull or scraping against a very hard another piece of brain and causing more symptoms than you would get if your brain was fluid and malleable and so on. So he studied 300 people on this particular diet, and most of the people that had relapsing, remitting MS, which I don't have, they went for many years without any sort of relapse because their brain stayed malleable. That was his theory. Whether it's true or whether it works or not, the evidence is there, but you can't really prove that that's why that's happening.
No, I mean, I guess that, it's studying people's brains while they're alive is a bit of a tricky thing to do, isn't it? But I mean, there is huge. I mean, the numbers now, and it's with George Jernek's work as well. It's the numbers are massive that people who have lower saturated fat diets, and they do say when you look around the world as well, like areas where naturally people's diet is lower saturated fats who tend to have lower instances of MS. So there is a huge amount of evidence there, isn't there? I think that has been fascinating because I've gone with the I follow Overcoming MS, so I have a low saturated fat diet, and I have fish oil, but I haven't really understood at all why these things are what they are. So that's absolutely fascinating, and I think and have someone who actually understands the chemistry of it and has MS and is backing those theories up. There is some science behind it.
Yes.
So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for joining us, Mike Newton.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Living Well with MS. Please check out this episode's show notes at overcomingms.org/podcast. You'll find useful links and bonus information there. Have questions or ideas to share? Email us at podcast@overcomingms.org, or you can reach out to Jeff on Twitter @JeffAlex. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks again for tuning in, and see you next time for tips on living a full and happy life with MS.